Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Immersing pupils in a new language with Dr. Mirain Rhys and Dr. Katharine Young. Welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, where we're lucky enough to have two guests from our own university, different school of Sport and Health Sciences. From the field of psychology, we've got Dr. Mirain Rhys and Dr. Katharine Young, who are here to talk to us about an interesting topic. But first of all, Mirain, do you want to just introduce yourself to our listeners, give them a sense of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having us on. My name's Mirain. I'm a psychology lecturer in the School of Sport and Health Sciences. I studied bilingualism and minority languages for a PhD, and that kind of sparked or continued my interest, I suppose, in minority languages and education. And so that's the field of research that I work in, and I'm mainly interested in turning policy documentation and evidence into, I suppose, like tangible or useful things that people can do, pick up, use in their own practice. And I'm also interested in parental experiences of Welsh medium education in terms of like motivations and attitudes, and maybe informing, you know, the way that works in Wales.
And Dr. Katharine, newly doctored Katharine, congratulations, Llongyfarchiadau. Tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm Katharine, newly doctored, and I am interested in the Welsh language generally and how the language varies from one situation to another. So I'm a variationist sociolinguist. But also the reason why I've got such a particular interest in what we're going to be talking about today is because I moved to Wales when I was 10, and then I attended one of these immersion centres that we're going to be talking about as a newcomer to Wales. And so I've got quite a personal experience which relates to this. And then I went to study to become a secondary school teacher with Teach First. And so I did 3 years of secondary school teaching, and then went into my PhD and now work at Cardiff Met. And so I'm very interested in late immersion in general, but also, as I say, in Welsh language related matters. Thanks for having us.
Croeso, welcome to you both. It's really good to have you both on. I think we've given the game away, but we should just make it clear that you're here to talk to us about immersion education. And I think before we get into that and some of the evidence that you've been engaging with just lately via a rapid evidence assessment that you did and have published on the Welsh Government website. Immersion education can mean different things in different international locations, but we really are going to want to know, what does it mean when applied in Wales? So if you could sort of demystify immersion education for us, that would be quite a helpful place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So immersion basically talks about the process of submerging a learner in a linguistic experience. So it's trying to get across quite an intensive pedagogy for very rapidly acquiring a second language. This happens in Wales in a number of ways. Like I mentioned with my own experience, I went to a late immersion centre, and those exist all over Wales now. In each local authority, where children who are newcomers to Wales, or children who, for whatever reason, decide to switch from English medium to Welsh medium education, they will go and spend usually about 12 weeks, but it does vary from one place to the next, in a late immersion centre. But what we've also noticed, and this came out as we were writing this report for Welsh Government over the past couple of years, is that actually the strategies that we apply to immersion education can also be applied to Welsh medium education where there are children who don't speak Welsh at home. So actually what we're talking about with immersion isn't necessarily a type of education, but we're talking about a type of learner. So an immersion learner is somebody who doesn't necessarily have access to the language outside of the school setting, and so the teachers are working quite hard to catch them up. I think that sort of summarises it, Mirain.
Yeah. So they're learning everything at school through the medium of Welsh. And the majority of children who attend Welsh medium schools in Wales come from homes where Welsh isn't spoken. Obviously, there's been a massive kind of language shift over the past 20, 30 years. There obviously are still families who speak Welsh at home, But that's why we concentrate on the learner being immersed rather than the education being immersive, because there are children who come from Welsh-speaking homes who then continue to learn Welsh and learn through Welsh at school, who I suppose are still being immersed, but in a different way to maybe children who don't hear the Welsh language at home.
I suppose this is an interesting point for listeners who are perhaps unfamiliar with Welsh medium education, or perhaps even in Wales and haven't sort of come into the teaching profession yet. I suppose there might be an assumption that if a child is going to a Welsh medium school, they maybe come from an old Welsh family where Welsh has always been spoken. They speak Welsh, over the tea table and all that kind of thing. But Welsh medium education is really sort of popular and quite aspirational, isn't it? And so you've actually got an awful lot of pupils who come to Welsh medium education because maybe their parents have got aspirations for them, that kind of thing. There's lots of really good jobs in Wales where it's considered pretty important to be able to speak both languages because they both have the same legal status. So that's a real challenge for teachers. I mean, I hadn't realised this until I read some of your stuff, that actually so many children are not speaking Welsh at home.
Yeah, and it is a continued challenge because essentially what we're dealing with is like this dual reasoning behind sending your child to Welsh medium education. On the one hand, you've got the Welsh Government saying what you've exactly just said there, there's lots of different jobs that are available through the medium of Welsh. So it's one of the reasons why you might consider sending your child to Welsh medium education. But language is intrinsically linked to all of our identity. And the development of that is also intrinsically linked to Welsh medium education. So teachers are doing a lot of things. They're developing children's skills, but they're also developing children's kind of sense of identity as Welsh people. And that can develop outside of learning Welsh, obviously. But one of the unique parts, I suppose, of Welsh medium education is that they automatically gain that knowledge and insight into their own identity and what it means to use the language in different situations. And one of the struggles, I suppose, that teachers face a lot of the time is children using it or not using it outside of the classroom, which was part of your PhD research, Katharine.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And you mentioned, Tom, about it being quite an aspirational thing, and I would argue that is the case, but for certain areas in particular. So there are parts of Wales where it's the only option is to go to Welsh medium education. It's not necessarily because it's considered the middle class option, it's because it's the only option. And that's not necessarily the case in Cardiff. And obviously we're working at Cardiff Met, where a lot of the teachers that we're training are going to be based in South East Wales potentially. So there is potentially that kind of culture that exists around here. But I think one of the challenges of working in this field is that actually Welsh education looks so different across different parts of Wales because the sociolinguistic landscape of Wales is so varied, which is a blessing because there's a lot of diversity. But on the other hand, it makes it a little bit challenging when you're trying to come up with like a consistent approach to teaching.
Coming back to the definition, there were two sort of terms that came up in the report. You alluded to, or you actually mentioned one earlier on, Katharine, in relation to your own experience of late immersion, and then you've got early immersion. It might be useful for listeners to know what we're talking about. It's probably obvious, but what are we talking about there, late and early immersion?
So we're talking there, it's a great question, and I'm sorry, I probably should have made it a bit clearer earlier on, but we're talking about basically different age groups. So if you're coming in after the age of 7 to Welsh medium education, you are classed as a newcomer or a latecomer, and so you would be receiving late immersion. But if you're starting your school through the medium of Welsh from the age of whatever, 3 or 4, whatever, then you would be receiving early immersion. But again, even though we distinguish between these two types of immersion, actually many of the strategies are the same because they're a similar type of learner. And so what we've been doing recently, Mirain and I, is we've been speaking to teachers in a late immersion network of teachers around Wales, and also speaking to teachers who are early immersion teachers. And what we're finding is that there is a lot of crossover and yet not so much dialogue between the two about like things that they think work. And so I think it's nice for Mirain and I because we can sort of start to bridge some of those gaps. Yeah.
And additionally, a lot of the research out there will highlight that, the earlier you start with immersion, the better, essentially, in terms of those children developing their skills in that language. But there's been a shift, I suppose, with, the development of late immersion in Wales, because we're understanding that lots of people will move into Wales and want that option, but a lot of people also might change their minds and want to send their children to immersion education later on. And so I suppose the policy and the funding from Welsh Government is supporting that now in each local authority. So again, going back to there's lots of different ways to do this, I suppose, and a lot of we've concentrated for a really long time in Wales on early immersion, whereas now I think it's opening up a bit more. There's more opportunities for children to dip into or join immersion.
Yeah.
And that consistency in terms of what works seems to be, like you said, that there seems to be a bit of a crossover, I suppose, in terms of the approaches, hence the research.
Question from me now. Feel free to tell me you don't know or you don't care. I'm just, I always have a sort of eye on our whole sort of audience, and obviously quite a lot of them are not in Welsh medium education, and quite a lot of them are probably not even in the UK, actually. We know we've got a decent chunk internationally. So when you're talking about this, my thoughts are now going to those people that work in schools where the vast majority of pupils don't speak English as a first language, and it's English medium education. So just in case we've got hordes of listeners switching off in droves at this point, apart from in Wales, would it be fair to say that what we're about to discuss now in this episode has got things to say to those people who perhaps work in other language mediums, but where lots of pupils are not speaking that? So English medium, centre of Cardiff, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of the evidence from the rapid evidence assessment, well, most of it is international research to begin with. So we're drawing on methods and approaches that take place in different linguistic contexts, but apply to Wales and to immersion.
Yeah, loads of the research actually that we're talking about is from the American context, so North American context, where we've got dual stream education happening between English and Spanish. I mean, like I mentioned before, the sociolinguistic landscape in Wales is unique and varied. But I mean, if we consider how vast America is, but I mean, the point is, I think that we're trying to make is that even thousands and thousands of miles away, when they're talking about completely different languages, teaching of a language is often a shared experience globally. So, definitely there are things I think that can apply to different situations. And one day we might be doing an international podcast talking about what happens in Wales and the Welsh practice rather than doing this the other way around. So
that would be lovely, wouldn't it?
it would.
If anyone wants to invite us anywhere, we're free all summer.
Haven't finished ours yet. Stay where you are.
Mirain, you spoke earlier on about it being sort of desirable to you to have a sort of practical application, the research having a practical application for teachers. In the report, you talk about the target language, which in our case in Wales would be Welsh, and the home language. And I wonder if you could do a bit of myth busting for me, because I would assume that to speak your home language in an immersion, a late immersion environment would be a big no-no. However, I was sort of heartened to see, or just interested actually, intrigued to see that actually in some of the studies that you looked at, it's actually can be helpful to bring in the home language. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, what did you find on that, and maybe let's bust that myth.
Yeah, so I think we have to first and foremost be quite careful when we're talking about the Welsh context, because essentially what we've got is a minority language competing with a majority language. And so I suppose when you say, well, I'm sure it would be quite useful to maybe use a bit of English in the Welsh immersion setting, just maybe to settle the kids in, or, for them to get that understanding. Often times with my own daughter, I will translate the Welsh word into English or the English word into Welsh so that she develops that understanding. But we also have this really sensitive maintenance model that we're using in Wales, where we're trying to revitalise the Welsh language. And so there's quite a lot of caution, I suppose, when you say things like, it would be really useful to use both languages in the classroom. But there's lots, like if we're going back to that, international breadth of knowledge that is in the rapid evidence assessment, we are talking here about lots of different linguistic geographies where there's still, I suppose, a similar situation in terms of the sensitivity between how many languages are used. But there's also evidence to suggest that when you do use a child's home language, it can support the development of the target language in that kind of educational setting. So one of the studies that is included in the assessment is using the target language on its own in immersion. It's like not enough. So the teacher's use of the target language can be meaningful when you include the children's home languages. And often the teacher isn't expected, I suppose, to know all of these home languages, right? So often it's maybe an invitation from the children to bring in their home languages and to use it in a meaningful way to gain understanding of the target language that they're using in school.
We saw some great examples of this. We did a research trip to Quebec last year, Mirain and I. Mirain and I do everything together. But we went to Quebec last year, and we went to go and visit a school that was doing classe d'accueil, which is what late immersion is called in Quebec. And the teacher, she was a newly qualified teacher, and she was obviously immersing them in French. But these kids came from a whole host of different language backgrounds. And her practice was fantastic at trying to draw out, how would you say that in Ukrainian? How would you say that in Spanish? And like using the home languages as like a tool, I guess, in the classroom. I can't say that she was necessarily doing the same with English. But on the other hand, so in that sense, the Quebec experience is quite similar to the Welsh experience, because we've got this global majority language of English, which is perceived to be a threat. But there are obviously in Cardiff, especially but also beyond, there are lots of home languages that are coming into the late immersion setting. So it's not necessarily just, we can use English now because this report says that it's okay, but it's about you meaningfully, as Mirain mentioned, drawing on the resources available to the students in order to make links. Because, that's a really a good way of consolidating the understanding of a new language.
I guess if all of these pupils are going home and then promptly switching back to their home language that they know, and I suppose this, again, will be relevant no matter what language you're talking about, but obviously we're talking particularly about Welsh. They're going home and they're starting to speak English probably because their parents maybe don't speak Welsh. It seems to me that it's going to be necessary to get the parents to do some stuff or to be aware of some stuff as well, because you're going to do potentially all this great stuff in the classroom and then it's going to be, there's a whole other world where it's not happening at all. So what did you come up with in terms of supporting the parents? I mean, like I said before, some of these parents are going to be totally on board, but as you rightly corrected me, Katharine, maybe some of them are not so much on board.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a whole section about this in the report. And basically you're trying to bring, if we're seeing the Welsh language development as a journey, you're trying to bring the parent along on that child's journey with them. And one of the studies that we looked at in the report was something that was done in South China, where the parents were encouraged to practice different language acquisition skills, so speaking, listening, reading and writing in English with their 6 to 7-year-old children. And because that shared homework experience and the parent was given explicit instruction on how to do the homework with the child, because that was a shared experience between the child and their parent, they noticed an increase in the literacy standards of the pupils themselves. So you can see from the evidence that involving the parent in curricular activities but that happen outside of the school context are a really good way of improving literacy in the children. And it was also the motivation. They noticed that the kids were far more motivated when they saw that their parents were also involved. But this, I think, is a key challenge beyond language instruction, is trying to get parents on board with.
We know in general that parents' engagement is one of the key factors in children's successful outcomes in education anyway. And when we spoke to early immersion teachers, this is one of the things, that is kind of really established in most Welsh medium schools, is that they provide bilingual resources to parents. They support parents with engaging with the school. It wasn't news, was it, to the early immersion teachers that this was something that would support immersion?
But potentially, I did notice a couple of the teachers, as we were talking about that specific piece of research, they were making notes as though they wanted that to be a priority. We also did an activity where we did post-it notes at the end. And I think some of them would be interested in sort of developing that further. But then I think the question maybe that might arise is, to what extent is it the individual teacher's responsibility to build a bridging link with the parent versus what the school is doing? And we had some really interesting discussions.
We did, yeah. So some of the kind of points that came out of that session, where we basically presented the findings from this research to teachers from South Wales, was they were interested in developing maybe more of a, like bringing parents into the school. Some teachers talked about how at the end of the day they have these recorded vocabulary buttons that you can press. So when the parents are waiting for their children to be released from the class, they can practice a few words. Or some teachers were talking about how they send home a sentence of the week to practice with their children and stuff. So a lot of teachers are doing these things as part of their practice. But again, I think there's always a worry that there needs to be more engagement. And I think that comes from both parents and teachers.
Coming back to the teachers, as you know, we recruit Welsh medium students to our initial, across the university, but particularly to our initial teacher education programmes. And one might make the assumption that they're all sort of really confident and fluent in the Welsh language. However, we know that that's not the case, because they sort of indicate their proficiency in the Welsh language when they come to us. I know, from an English medium perspective, that the quality of teacher talk in the classroom is really influential. And I wonder, what did you find in terms of the quality of the teacher talk with regard to the target language in the classroom? And are there any particular challenges that teachers face in an immersion context, that might be part and parcel of maybe some of the challenges that the pupils face? And did you find anything interesting about that thing?
Yeah, I'd say that generally, the difficulties faced by immersion teachers are similar to many of the difficulties faced by all teachers, which is, there's a finite length of time that you're with these children, and you're expected to do a hell of a lot in order to show that they're making progress. And what we've noticed is, from the research that we've done, is that in order for the use of the target language to be meaningful, teachers have to go beyond just doing surface level instructions. But of course, the challenge is, I've only got such and such amount of time. How do I then use meaningful language? How do I give each child the opportunity to expand on an answer rather than just saying yes or no? Or how do I, delve deeper into encouraging them to respond further? And so I think this issue of time kind of is reflected in your question to an extent. But the part of the problem can be that because the teacher is standing at the front of the class and giving out instructions in Welsh, they might think, tick, I've done that bit. I've done my bit of teacher talk. But in order to actually make it meaningful, you need to make sure that you're extending the opportunities for the pupils to be able to use the language back.
Mm-hmm. And that's something I think that was really clear from the conversations we had with early years teachers as well, is that they were, I suppose you could argue, confident in their ability to stand up, to give the instructions, to scaffold the language. But what they were struggling with was that kind of, what you would call maybe in the foundation phase as continuous provision. So when the children go off, especially in the early years, when they go off into, a role play area or something, they haven't got that scaffolding. They might switch back to English or whatever language they speak at home, or whatever language they are most confident in. And so they were worried that the children were losing that opportunity to continue to develop, to continue to use language in a meaningful way, essentially because there wasn't an adult there scaffolding. And again, we had lots of conversations on that day about, the retention crisis, not just with teachers, but also with, supporting individuals in the classroom. Funding and time is always an issue, isn't it? But they were really keen to understand what kind of approaches they could develop or instigate in those kinds of situations, so that the stuff they were doing at the beginning, the chalk and talk type of stuff, was also then mimicked in areas where maybe adults weren't necessarily always present. So they talked about, and I'm sure you already know about these kinds of things, but, there's like these little pegs that you can record messages on. So they're like little guides for what you do in maybe the enhanced or continuous provision instructions, essentially, and how they spoke about how children actually took it upon themselves to record their own instructions on these little pegs. But again, it's something meaningful and engaging that the children are doing. But again, it comes down to, the time and the resource available to be able to plan and do those kinds of intentional things.
But also you're contending with newcomers into a language, and so you're trying to scaffold because you're trying to teach them, but you're also trying to give them meaningful opportunities to use a language that they might not at all have the skills in yet anyway. And so I guess, it's about developing a sense of sort of self-awareness, I guess, in the classroom as a practitioner. Am I asking a question that is a sort of a yes/no answer that doesn't necessarily get the children to practice a construction that I've just taught them, or can I scaffold it in a way? Because obviously we're talking about learners who are using a language that is very, very new to them. And we're also trying to do it in a way that they won't just default back to English when they're struggling.
That whole sort of early years play, looking like play, but actually really complicated type thing. We've talked about it loads on here in various different contexts. And you mentioned that you'd studied people who are teaching these very, very young children and people who are teaching these very much older children. Is that an area where things do look a little bit different, where there are specific strategies that those child-led sort of foundation learning type people have to do really quite different things to the people that are working with the older pupils?
So there is one piece of research in the report that sort of talks about how we can use sociodramatic play, basically. But this was with 4 to 6 year olds, and it was for Arabic early immersion context in Iran. And what they found was that that sort of teacher-mediated sociodramatic play increased the use of Arabic in the classroom, which was the target language that they were trying to immerse the children in. And as part of that method, the children were leading on the play, and the teacher was using Arabic during the role play with the learners as well. So they were it was a co-constructed kind of, and obviously, like you say, that's kind of play-based. And for 4 to 6 year olds, I think that could work really well. If you've got somebody who's coming in at the age of 11, who's potentially a refugee from a war-torn country and is being immersed in Welsh, there would be strategies that might work that would be quite different from that potentially. So I think it's about knowing your learner, knowing what works for the age group, and trying to apply and kind of being bold with different strategies, trying stuff out, seeing if it works, and then ditching it if it doesn't, I guess.
Yeah. And when we held this kind of networking event with the immersion teachers, we were there talking about this research. We had Katharine Jones from Iaith, which is a language planning organisation, providing training on essentially using the research and planning intentionally for your next steps. But we also had Mirain Rhys, who's the head of late immersion in Cardiff. And she spoke at length, really, about how similar, I suppose, what you do in the early years is sometimes with older learners who are being immersed for the first time in the Welsh language, or in any language, I suppose, and having to think about not just the role of play and the role of, role play and games and songs and rhyming and, all the classic stuff that you'd maybe link to early immersion, how important that was in the late immersion classroom, but also considering the whole child. Like Katharine was saying, where they've come from, does the education needs to be kind of a little bit focused on learning Welsh as their new kind of found language, but also on their emotional development.
And their well-being.
Their well-being, yeah. So a lot of the late immersion practitioners now are developing into trauma-informed practitioners as well, because they're seeing a lot that it's really useful to consider the whole child, and that considering children's emotional health and well-being then develops their Welsh language skills because they feel safer, they feel welcomed, they feel like ready to learn, I suppose, if you're thinking about those kinds of terms. And I think, again, going back to the beginning of what we were talking about, you can apply that to any context to make sure that children feel safe and ready to learn, makes immersion more effective.
And I think that we probably shouldn't, it would be remiss of us not to mention that because we're talking about late immersion in much of this report, we are talking about a very small provision. And so we've got quite small class sizes where that nurturing environment does contribute to the learning. And a lot of there's a few of the pieces of research that we talk about in the report which do explicitly mention group sizes need to be small in order for this immersion education to work. And again, that comes back to this idea that, so like we were speaking to one of the teachers in the late immersion network last week, who was saying that, they know that for a number of their children, the adverse childhood experiences tally up to at least 3 per child in their classrooms. But they know that because there are very few of them in the class and they can really get to know them. So I think it's very much, in the case of late immersion, it's very much an interpersonal experience, I guess, between the teacher and the children, because there is space for that to happen. And so I guess that is a further caveat for this report. We're not just saying, okay, great, the answer is have really small class sizes and then everyone will be okay, because that's not practical, that's not necessarily always possible. But in the case of late immersion, it is something that has been found to be very, very effective.
And in the case of immersion, there's lots of examples from the research, but also from stuff that happens in schools where small groups are taken out of the classroom when that's an opportunity to do so. And so teachers are always evolving their practice to suit the needs of their children.
And also with the changing landscape. So one of the teachers that we spoke to last week was saying that because the late immersion provision is very new, they've only been running it for the last 3 years. This is in a local authority in South Wales. They don't have a classroom. They have a space in the school, which is a corridor. And so what she does is she has these, I think it's about 6 children in the class. And the class is just standing in the corridor and doing lots of singing and learning through play and things like that. And so again, you're working with the resource that you have. And a lot of these teachers are bold and, are trying lots of these strategies, but they're doing it in circumstances that sometimes are quite restrictive. And so we see a lot of creativity. And so I guess it's great that we've done this piece of research that looks at what works in the international context. But I guess I just also wanted to take the opportunity to applaud many of the practitioners who are working in this context in Wales, who are doing an amazing job with a varied amount of support financially, we should say. So, yeah.
I agree.
Bringing it back to specific pedagogies and classroom practices, there were a couple of terms that came up in the report that weren't new to me, but I just wanted sort of clarity on. There was code switching, and this was in reference to dual language books and stories, and translanguaging. And I wondered if you could sort of give our listeners a sense of what we mean by those terms and how and to what extent those approaches support literacy in both languages.
Code switching is when you use all of your linguistic repertoire to speak in sentences, paragraphs, And I do it all the time when I'm speaking Welsh.
It's like Wenglish.
It's Wenglish, which is a language in itself, where you might not necessarily be able to, maybe in my case, remember the word that I want to use in Welsh, and so I just use the English one. And
it happens in your English as well, where you use a Welsh word. Yeah. Depending on who you're talking to, but yeah. So code switching is
So and often in the research, it hasn't really been applauded as something that should be encouraged. It hasn't really been recognised as something that's useful for language learning, but it actually is. It actually demonstrates really complex use of language, and I often think as well that I use it maybe in different contexts, whereas translanguaging is similar to code switching, but used in more of an education environment, and it's used particularly to encourage bilingualism within the classroom. So, for example, a classic translanguaging example is you're studying science through the medium of Welsh. The textbook is only available in English, and so the task is to read the instructions for a task in your science English textbook and to then practically conduct maybe an experiment or follow the instructions in the class and to talk about it in Welsh and maybe even to write it up in Welsh or English. And the argument behind the translanguaging structure, I suppose, for a classroom task is that you're consolidating that knowledge because you have to really understand it to be able to maybe translate it in your head, essentially, to develop that kind of cognitive ability to understand it and then implement whatever you've understood in a different language. So, and that, translanguaging, is something that's applauded and encouraged within education. So they're very similar, those two terms, but I think the attitudes around them are different.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons that the attitude towards code switching is quite negative is because there's this, and this isn't in the report, but there is this attitude that pure Welsh is the ideal Welsh. And so it kind of exists under what is known as a standard language ideology, where actually the only way to speak Welsh is to speak Welsh in a way that is either standard and thus correct, or is very sort of linked to specific dialects in order to show your authenticity or legitimacy in that language, which is a whole other podcast in itself probably. But it is really interesting, especially since so many people are coming out of the Welsh medium education context and system feeling unconfident or not as confident as they could be with their Welsh language skills because they view their own language use as being deficient because sometimes they can't remember the word for something in Welsh. And
yeah, we have this on the PGCE. We have a lot of Welsh medium students. You know, we're desperate for Welsh medium teachers. We've said it so many times. And they come and maybe they've done their degree over in England. You know, they spent 3 years in England doing their degree in English, and they come in and they actually think they can't be a Welsh medium teacher. And it was when I was talking to colleagues about that I realised that there was almost sometimes, if you weren't very careful with how you handled it, a bit of a sort of divide within a Welsh speaking class as to whether you were a first language or a second language or how confident you were. And then that made me think, well, you know, the obvious threat to Welsh is the march of English. But is there a less obvious one, which is, and I say this with love maybe, some people who perhaps need to get over it a little bit if people's Welsh is not kind of, you know, absolutely Shakespearean, excellent and, you know, suitable for the stage. Yeah.
And we see that not just with Welsh and English, but with lots and lots of other languages across the world. And it's a tough one because essentially it is definitely a threat. You know, if you don't feel like you belong for a particular kind of reason, that can then inhibit how often you use the language, which is really what we don't want at all. And it's going back to, you know, teachers, you know, being worried about how the children aren't speaking Welsh on the playground, for example. There's lots of different elements to being able to confidently speak Welsh and do that in particular kinds of contexts. And that's going to be different for everyone, I think, depending on your own experience. But it is certainly, you know, another kind of threat to to us all.
Like the exclusive club that blackballs itself out of existence, you know?
Yeah, and doesn't it have some sort of really sort of high stakes consequences if you're a parent or carer considering late immersion for your child because you think, well, actually job prospects in Wales open up to my young person, you know, to my child. Is that sort of not really the right term, but snobbery around the Welsh language? Is that something that, you know, could be a barrier if you wanted to get into the media, if you want, you know, is that if you wanted to get into Welsh government, if you know, are those job opportunities restricted somewhat, and are we therefore maybe causing parents to question, well, is this going to be the right route for my young person if they're not going to reach that level of proficiency that's actually going to get them into those jobs at the end?
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is understanding around bilingualism. Obviously, we're in a position where we have maybe more of an informed understanding of bilingualism because it's literally what we've studied for a lot of our career. But that isn't the case for a lot of parents considering Welsh medium education at whatever stage, or any kind of language education that's different to the language that they speak at home. So, for example, when you were talking there about restricting opportunities, in my head I was thinking about all the opportunities for adults to develop their own Welsh medium proficiency. There's loads of support from like the Centre for Learning Welsh to develop the working Welsh. There's a whole programme called Cymraeg Gwaith Plus or Work Welsh Plus, which is there to support people to become confident Welsh speakers at work, for example. So, and then again, you know, in understanding your role as a parent, I think is another key part in bilingual education. Essentially, it is more of an effort to send your child to Welsh medium education, but it's a choice that you're making. And I think really there's a responsibility on us as researchers and educators, but also the Welsh Government to provide informed information to parents about what it actually means. Because a lot of the stuff that comes out about bilingual education, because we're in this maintenance model where we're trying to get more, you know, Welsh medium teachers and more children in Welsh medium education, we're on a bit of a roll in terms of how amazing it is as an experience. But the reality sometimes is very different for a lot of people. And I think it's really important to then consider what the reality looks like and what your role as a parent is in that journey. Again, coming back to this kind of analogy of a journey. Your child's going on a journey, but you're also going on a journey. And there's loads of like considerations along the way. So I think I personally come from a mindset, I suppose, where, yes, we know that there's people out there who would say that if you're not speaking Welsh completely in its purest form, you're not doing the language the service you're supposed to be doing. Whereas I personally think that if we approach it from more of an empathetic, holistic mindset, because essentially the government is saying Cymraeg I bawb, Welsh for all, right? So how do we get to that point? How do we get parents who maybe aren't convinced yet to take a chance? Because you are taking a huge chance. If you don't speak the language yourself, there's stumbling blocks along the way. And then what can we do as researchers and educators and the Welsh Government? And what can we do to support those parents to think to themselves, I've made the right decision?
And this brings me back to something I was musing over when I was reading the report, which is, you know, we've got this backdrop of this ambitious target of 1 million speakers of Welsh by 2050. And we find that in English medium initial teacher education provision, it is part of the professional standards for teaching and leadership that student teachers must, to gain qualified teacher status, show a commitment to learning Welsh and to developing their Welsh language skills. And certainly they get a lot of support to do that. And we get international students coming on the programme. So, you know, everybody has that expectation. What struck me about some of the findings in, I think it was particularly in the early immersion setting, was that to just be sort of speaking the language, we spoke about this earlier in the episode, to just be sort of using it incidentally, which we see quite a lot. You know, a commitment might be interpreted as I welcome my class in Welsh. I ask them to stand up and sit down, some basic commands, and can write. However, I wondered if there was something more powerful in the findings around vocabulary building. All teachers, particularly in the secondary phase, although not exclusively, they're coming across these new sort of lexical sets that are very like disciplinary specific vocabulary and language. And I wondered if your report had something to tell us in the English meeting setting about how we can make vocabulary stick and maybe how we can therefore get more meaningful integration and implementation of Welsh in the classroom that goes beyond, basic commands that perhaps might not be as impactful as we'd like.
Yeah, so one of the pieces of research that was in the report was by Young et al. That talks about explicit instruction and how that can be potentially an antidote to that kind of incidental language development when you're not talking about the target language. And this study was done with learners who were in Hong Kong, and it was an 8-week intervention with children between the ages of 4 and 6. And essentially, it focused on using 4 words in the target language in each session. So something that's maybe realistic, in the English medium context. And these new words presented, they were unfamiliar to the learners, but they were easy to explain. So you could, again, link that back to things that some people might call tokenistic in English medium education when you're using the Welsh language. But again, this evidence kind of suggests that using the target language in this kind of way, in an explicit, targeted way, might be useful.
And then that you build activities round those 4 words throughout the day then, or throughout the session. So it's not just, right, here are 4 words, but it's then also just, it's looking at how you can extend an activity or use a storybook or try and incorporate those 4 words into a wider learning experience. But basically, I think the point of this is that you don't have to learn loads and loads and loads of new vocab and expect it all to stick, but start small, but make it meaningful. Mm-hmm. So embed it into the session that you're taking.
So the findings from that study was that progress was seen in terms of expressive and receptive vocabulary and phonological awareness amongst these learners because of this intervention. And then the authors talked about how practitioners should consider maybe focusing more on this kind of vocabulary development for themselves, but also for the children through maybe explicit instruction. So again, it's, we were talking earlier about how immersion teachers use stories and rhymes and songs and these kinds of intentional but maybe not explicit ways of immersing children in the language. But those kinds of things can be applied out of immersion as well. A little bit goes a long way, I suppose, is the key there.
So perhaps, I wouldn't want to be my usual cynical self, but there is a tendency sometimes to tick the box. When Katharine, you talked about ticking the box, didn't you, earlier on, that maybe particularly when Estin are perceived to be imminent and they're downstairs at the moment, I'm going to try and get them in, that Welsh sort of proliferates around a school, objects get labelled, notice boards get commandeered, people are on a 3-line whip to say da iawn when something good happens, that sort of thing. Does what you've said kind of give the sense that perhaps having less but a bit more coherent would be more useful than just peppering kind of inanimate objects and sentences with words and going, well, I've done my Welsh now, hooray.
I think it's a spectrum. I think you need the visual representation and it serves a purpose. But additionally to that, you have to be intentional with the way that you use it. And often, unfortunately, there's not enough support or training for teachers to understand how to do that. And then even if there was training, there's not enough time in the day to fit it in. So it's really important to consider the practicalities and the reality of what this research turns into in schools, right? And I think that's one of the struggles, I suppose, is how do we engage the teaching profession, how can they see this as something that's meaningful to them? So I think in that example particularly, it needs to be like a suite of stuff that you incorporate. But we also need to consider that in the wider context of everything else that a teacher might need to do in a given day.
But I mean, and this is potentially more relevant to the secondary school context, but from my own experience as a second language Welsh teacher in a secondary school, like there is a tremendous resource, even in English schools, of proficient Welsh users who potentially would be able to share some of their experience around, not just increasing the visibility, which is what you were saying, sort of peppering signs around willy-nilly, which does serve a purpose, because I think, again, like Mirain was saying, that at least it's showing, or it's acknowledging that we live in a bilingual country, but it has to go further than that. And so it can't just be incidental.
Yeah, and I think what I've sort of been reflecting on from the examples of pedagogy and practice in immersion contexts that might be really useful in English medium contexts is that actually it could have a dual purpose. We talked about translanguaging and needing to know something really well to be able to translate that. And I can see that, in a very purposeful and meaningful way playing out in a drama classroom, a second drama teacher. I can see how, explicit vocabulary instruction, and also kind of that jumping around and going, okay, well, what does it mean in that language and how is that broadening our understanding of the concept that word represents can sometimes be quite interesting. That, if there's not a direct translation from one language to another, often the words that are used and what they mean in those different languages can give you a broader understanding of what that concept is. So we've had some really interesting conversations in the drama classroom around that. I think that's just my summary of what I can take into the English medium context. So, is there anything else that you think that listeners who are in English medium settings can take from this work that might influence their pedagogy and practice that we haven't covered already?
I was just thinking about the curriculum for Wales, I suppose, and one of the main kind of aims of developing learners as kind of citizens of Wales, but also the world, right? And what you just described there is an example of how we can become more empathetic towards other cultures, other people in our lives, other people we live around and go to school with. And so I think actually, potentially having a go and looking at this kind of research, this piece of research, might give other teachers like yourselves reflections on their own practice. Even though we're talking about immersion, again, there's clearly a theme here where Welsh is for everyone. And I think everyone recognises that, even in English medium education. So what can you do? Because we've talked about this report being applicable to lots of different contexts, the late immersion context, the early immersion context, but maybe the English medium context as well in Wales, and being part of that kind of narrative or discourse around how do we implement the new curriculum effectively.
Because when in the English medium sector, we're not necessarily trying to create proficient or competent users of Welsh, but we're trying to produce curious people who don't have a closed mind about potentially going on to learn more. Because regardless of the medium of instruction, regardless of the school type, regardless of the location in Wales, these are all children who the Welsh Government has decided to place on the same continuum. So from somebody who has no proficiency to somebody who is highly fluent, we're all on that same continuum, regardless of the fact that our school category might be English medium or could be Welsh medium. And I think as long as we are opening the children's minds to the potential of becoming a Welsh speaker, either themselves or, eventually they might go on to have children and they might come to make a decision about the medium of instruction for their own child. It's about, I guess, maintaining an open mind. So I think that's one of the ways in which it can really apply.
Okay, thank you very much. There's so much to dig into there, and will be of interest of lots of teachers and people in education out there. we have our short slots, something interesting and something to try. You're something interesting. You've been sort of getting this research out there and talking to teachers. And I think your something interesting relates to some conversations you've been having recently with teachers in immersion settings.
Yeah, it does. So I think from consolidating the research in lots of different spaces, I think what's interesting to me now is, it just so happened last week we were speaking to a group of early immersion teachers, and then we attended a late immersion network that Welsh Government host. And in thinking of the findings from this research and just immersion in general, I think the interesting thing is we're all in it together. There's lots of things in this report that is applicable to early immersion, to late immersion, and like we've talked about today, to English medium education as well in Wales. And so I think potentially, the reach of these kinds of findings is maybe wider than we first expected. And I think I'll continue to reflect on that for a little while longer, because it might be useful to think about, the tangible outcomes from this report and how they can apply to lots of different settings.
And with that in mind, Katharine, you've got something that our listeners can try.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a shameless plug. So you can try and read our report that we've written, that we've been discussing this morning. And it's on the Welsh Government website, listed under their statistics and research landing page. And if you just type in language immersion education, it'll take you to a landing page where there's a lot of me and Mirain that will appear.
Great.
But the latest one is Effective Approaches and Methods in Immersion Education, a Rapid Evidence Assessment. And that's where the report is. And there are loads and loads of strategies that we talk about from all of the different pieces of literature. I think we refer to, was it 41? Yeah, 41 pieces of literature, and they are all talking about slightly different approaches. So why not read the report and try one of the approaches and see how you get on?
Well, we will do our best to stick some links in the notes for you as well, so our listeners can go and try.
There's also a teacher-specific or practitioner-focused summary document, I suppose, that you might want to open first if that suits you.
There we go, knock yourself out.
Mirain, Katharine, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for joining us today, and best of luck with your sort of future research and practice-based endeavours. We hope to have you back at some point in the future. For our listeners, we'll be back with you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll be in your ears very soon.
You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. The special guests this episode were Dr. Mirain Rhys and Dr. Katharine Young from here at Cardiff Met, and thanks to them for taking part. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blanford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. Technical support from Peter Lamburn, and the studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We're on social media at Talk Teaching Pod if you want to come and say hello. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.